What if the life you are currently living is being built on a fraction of what you are actually capable of? Not because you lack talent, opportunity, or intelligence, but because you have never been forced to discover where your real limits actually end. David Goggins wrote, "Can't Hurt Me" not as a motivational story, but as a confrontation, a raw, unfiltered account of a man who was dealt one of the most brutal starting hands imaginable and chose, through deliberate psychological warfare against himself, to become one of the most physically and mentally capable human beings alive. David Goggins is a retired Navy SEAL, a former Army Ranger, and the only member of the United States Armed Forces ever to complete SEAL training, Army Ranger School, and Air Force Tactical Air Controller training. He held the world record for the most pull-ups completed in 24 hours. He has run ultra-marathons through Death Valley. He has finished races on broken bones. But none of that is the point of this book. The point is the interior journey, the psychological transformation that made all of those external achievements possible, and the tools he used to execute it. By the end of this analysis, you will understand how Goggins built an unbreakable mind from ruins, what the accountability mirror actually demands of the person brave enough to use it, and why most people are operating at a fraction of their true capacity every single day without realizing it. Subscribe to the Book Vault right now and hit the like button. Every week, this channel delivers transformational analyses built specifically for the people who refuse to settle for the version of themselves that comfort and convenience have produced. The Strategic Breakdown. The starting point. A broken beginning. We begin at the origin of everything Goggins would become, and it is important to understand just how far from greatness that origin actually was. Goggins grew up in a household shaped by violence, poverty, and fear. His father was an abusive man who controlled the family through intimidation, and the childhood Goggins describes in the opening of this book is one of survival rather than development. He witnessed things no child should witness and absorbed a level of psychological damage that would have permanently defined a lesser version of his story. For years, it did define him. By his mid-20s, Goggins was 300 pounds, working a night job exterminating cockroaches, and living a life he describes as completely disconnected from any meaningful purpose. He was not merely unhappy. He was hollowed out, defeated not by a single dramatic failure, but by the quiet, accumulated weight of a life built on avoidance and fear. The person sitting on that couch watching television at 2 in the morning was not yet the person the world would come to know. He was someone drowning in the distance between who he was and who he sensed, somewhere deep beneath the surface that he could become. The reason Goggins spends so much time in this part of the book is intentional. He is not building sympathy. He is building context, because the transformation that follows only makes complete sense when you understand the depth of the hole he was climbing out of, and the first tool he reached for. The first principle he applied to begin the climb was one that most people find deeply uncomfortable. Not because it is complex, but because it is honest: the accountability mirror. The first principle Goggins introduces, and one of the most quietly devastating ideas in the entire book, is what he calls the accountability mirror. The concept arrived in a moment of raw confrontation with himself, standing in front of a bathroom mirror and refusing to look away from what he saw. Not the physical reflection alone, but the gap between the person he presented to the world and the person he knew himself to actually be. He began writing his truths on Post-it notes and sticking them to the mirror, not affirmations, not motivational quotes. Honest, uncomfortable statements about what he was avoiding, what he was lying to himself about, and what he needed to change. Most people use mirrors to check their appearance. Goggins used this to conduct an interrogation. The distinction matters enormously. Self-deception is one of the most comfortable and most destructive habits a human being can maintain, because it costs nothing in the short term and everything in the long term. Every time you look away from your own uncomfortable truths, you are making a deposit into the account of a smaller life. The accountability mirror forces a withdrawal. It demands that you name the specific lies you are telling yourself with specificity and honesty before any real change becomes structurally possible. The practical power of this tool is not in the mirror itself, but in the discipline of sustained honesty it requires. Goggins did not do this once. He returned to it consistently, updating the notes as old challenges were confronted and new ones were acknowledged. Over time, the practice built something more valuable than motivation. It built a relationship with himself that was grounded in reality rather than comfort. That foundation of honest self-knowledge is what made every subsequent physical and mental challenge survivable. Because when you know exactly who you are and exactly what you need to change, the path forward, however brutal, is at least clear. taking souls. There is a concept Goggins introduces through one of the most vivid competitive stories in the book, and he calls it taking souls. The idea emerged during his first attempt at Navy SEAL training, the notoriously brutal program known as BUD/CES, where instructors use every psychological and physical tool available to break candidates and force voluntary withdrawal. Goggins was singled out, targeted, made to perform extra repetitions, subjected to additional cold water exposure, and treated with a deliberate harshness designed to communicate one message: you do not belong here. And this is where his response becomes the lesson. Instead of shrinking, Goggins chose to turn the instructor's intensity into fuel. Every time an instructor pushed harder, Goggins performed harder, not out of anger, but out of a calculated decision to make himself so visibly resilient that his perseverance became the more powerful force in the room. Taking souls is the practice of outworking, outperforming, and outlasting the person or circumstance that is attempting to diminish you, with such obvious dedication that the dynamic shifts. You are no longer the target. You become the standard, and the people who are trying to break you begin almost involuntarily to respect what they are witnessing. The psychological insight buried in this concept runs deeper than competitive performance. Goggins argues that taking souls is really about refusing to give another person or another circumstance the power to define your limits. When someone doubts you, the instinctive response is to either argue against the doubt or internalize it. Taking souls offers a third option: demonstrate the answer so completely that the doubt becomes irrelevant. This approach requires something most people do not have in sufficient supply: not strength, not talent. Something rarer and more trainable than both. And what Goggins reveals in the next chapter is where that thing actually lives: the cookie jar. At the 10-minute mark of this analysis, we arrive at the moment in Goggins' story that permanently changed how he understood his own capacity. And it happened during one of the most physically punishing endurance events in the American ultramarathon calendar. Goggins had entered a 100-mile race with almost no training, attempting to qualify for an event that required ultramarathon experience as a prerequisite. By mile 70, his body had begun to structurally break down. His feet were blistered and bleeding. His kidneys were failing. His legs had stopped functioning the way legs are supposed to function, and he had 30 miles remaining. What he reached for in that moment was not willpower in the conventional sense. It was memory. Goggins had developed what he calls the cookie jar, a mental inventory of every hard thing he had ever survived, every obstacle he had overcome, every moment where he had been counted out and refused to stay down. In the darkest hours of that race, he pulled from that jar deliberately, one memory at a time, using each one as evidence that he had been in the dark before and had come out the other side. He finished the race. With broken bones in his feet, with failing kidneys, he finished. The cookie jar is not nostalgia. It is a precision psychological tool. The distinction matters because most people revisit difficult past experiences as a source of pain rather than as a source of proof. Goggins reframes that entirely. Your hardest moments are not wounds, they are credentials. Every time you survived something that tried to stop you, you added to a reservoir of evidence that you are the kind of person who does not stop. The cookie jar is the act of making that evidence available to yourself in real time when the present moment is trying to convince you that this time, finally, you have reached your actual limit. Removing the governor. The chapter Goggins dedicates to what he calls removing the governor introduces the single most psychologically liberating idea in the entire book, and it begins with a biological fact most people have never fully reckoned with. The human brain, as a protective mechanism, imposes performance limits on the body well before the body's actual physical capacity is exhausted. Researchers and physiologists refer to this as the central governor theory, the idea that the brain throttles output, generating the sensation of maximum effort long before true maximum effort has actually been reached. What feels like your limit is almost never your limit. Goggins estimated, based on his own experience and observation, that most people operate at roughly 40% of their true capacity on any given day, not because they are lazy or undisciplined, but because the brain's protective architecture is doing exactly what it was designed to do: conserve resources, minimize risk, and avoid the discomfort zone where genuine adaptation occurs. The 40% rule is not a number Goggins derived from a laboratory. It is a conviction born from personal experience of repeatedly discovering that what felt like the end was actually a threshold with more available beyond it. Removing the governor does not mean ignoring genuine physical injury or recklessly destroying your body for the sake of performance. Goggins is specific about this distinction. It means developing the ability to recognize the difference between the brain's protective discomfort signals and the body's actual structural limits. That recognition is a skill. It is built through repeated voluntary exposure to hard things, to choosing discomfort consistently until the relationship between sensation and meaning is rewritten. Every time you go past the first wave of wanting to stop, you are widening the gap between your perceived limit and your real one. The armored mind. The concept Goggins describes in this chapter is one that resonates far beyond physical training, and he calls the result of sustained mental hardening the armored mind. The idea is not that an armored mind feels no pain, no fear, and no doubt. Goggins is explicit that he experiences all of those things. The armored mind is the capacity to feel those things fully and continue anyway, because the relationship between discomfort and identity has been fundamentally rewritten through accumulated experience of choosing the harder path when the easier one was available. The armor is not numbness. It is context. Goggins built this armor through a practice he calls on the mind. The same way physical calluses developed through repeated friction against resistance, mental calluses developed through repeated voluntary exposure to hard things. Cold water, impossible distances, humiliating failures. Every time he chose the option that cost him something and survived it, the experience became a layer of psychological protection he could draw on the next time the environment tried to break him. Not because the next hard thing was easier, because his relationship with hard things had fundamentally changed. The distinction between the armored mind and simple stubbornness is worth pausing on. Stubbornness refuses to adapt. The armored mind is the product of intelligent, deliberate adaptation. Goggins failed his first attempt at SEAL selection. He failed more than once before he succeeded in the endeavors that defined his career. The armor was not built from victories alone. It was built from the pattern of returning after failures, absorbing the lesson, and coming back harder. That pattern, repeated consistently over years, is what produced a mind that adversity could no longer reach. Talent is not enough. There is a chapter in this book that lands like a challenge directed personally at every reader who has ever used their natural talent as a reason not to work harder. And it is where Goggins addresses the comfortable lie that talent is the primary currency of achievement. He is not dismissive of talent. He simply argues, from personal experience and from observation of the people who surrounded him in elite military environments, that talent without obsessive effort is a ceiling, not a platform. The most talented person in the room is rarely the most dangerous. The most obsessively committed person is. Goggins watched talented people quit. He watched gifted athletes withdraw from programs that demanded more than comfort would permit. He watched individuals who were measurably superior to him by conventional physical metrics fail to sustain the effort required in circumstances where the environment stopped cooperating. And he watched people with no obvious natural advantages, including himself, outlast them through sheer unwillingness to accept the story that their limitations were fixed. Talent tells you where you start. It says almost nothing about where you finish. The practical implication Goggins draws from this chapter is direct. He asks the reader to identify the area of their life where they are relying on talent or past success as a substitute for current effort. Not to shame themselves for that reliance, but to see it clearly for what it is, a comfortable arrangement between the present self and the future self that produces comfort now and regret later. The most dangerous moment in a talented person's life is not failure. It is the first time success arrives without full effort. Because from that moment forward, the gap between what they could achieve and what they actually pursue begins to quietly widen. The empowerment of failure. We arrive at the final chapter of the strategic breakdown, and Goggins closes the framework with the insight that took him the longest to internalize and that he believes has the most transformational power for everyone who genuinely receives it. The insight is this: failure is not the opposite of the path forward. It is the path forward. Not in the motivational poster sense of the phrase, but in a specific operational, tactical sense. Every failure contains the precise information required to close the gap between your current capability and your next level. The only question is whether you are willing to sit with it long enough to extract that information. Goggins describes a practice he calls the after-action review, borrowed from military protocol, where after every failure, setback, or underperformance, you conduct a deliberate, honest debrief of what happened, why it happened, and what specific adjustment would produce a different outcome next time. Not a general reflection, a precise diagnosis. Most people treat failure as an emotional event to be survived and then moved past as quickly as possible. Goggins treats it as operational data. The difference in what each approach produces over a career is not subtle. The most important word in this chapter is not failure. It is empowerment. Goggins is not suggesting that failure feels good or that suffering is a virtue. He is suggesting that the person who learns to extract meaning, adjustment, and forward momentum from their most painful experiences is operating with a resource that the person who avoids failure never accumulates. Over time, the capacity to learn from failure compounds the same way any other practice skill does, and the person who has failed more, learned more, and returned more times becomes, eventually, genuinely difficult to stop. Key lessons and insights. The accountability mirror demands radical honesty. The first lesson Goggins teaches, and the one that must precede every other transformation, is that meaningful change begins not with action, but with honest self-confrontation. What the accountability mirror demands is not self-criticism or self-hatred. It is the specific, unflinching acknowledgement of the gap between who you are presenting yourself as and who you actually are in private. Most people live their entire lives managing that gap rather than closing it, investing enormous energy in the performance of a version of themselves they have never fully become, and quietly exhausting themselves in the effort. The practical application is to identify, in writing, the 3 most significant areas of your life where you are currently telling yourself a comfortable story that you know is not entirely true. Not vague dissatisfactions, but specific discrepancies. The commitment you are not honoring, the discipline you are not maintaining, the potential you are watching go unrealized. Write them down. Look at them without flinching. Then, ask what one specific behavior change, if maintained for 30 days, would begin to close the most important gap. That question, answered honestly, is the beginning of the kind of change Goggins' life demonstrates is possible. The cookie jar is built through accumulated hard choices. The second lesson, and the one with the most direct daily application, is that the mental reserves you will need in your hardest future moments are built through the hard choices you make in your easiest present ones. The cookie jar is not filled during a crisis. It is filled in advance through every moment where you chose the harder option when the easier one was fully available. Every early morning, every completed set when you wanted to stop, every honest conversation when avoidance would have been simpler, every boundary held when comfort tempted you to release it. Those choices compounded to a resource most people never realized they could have built. The practical application is to identify one daily hard choice that you currently avoid, something specific and recurring that you know would build you, but that you consistently rationalize away. It does not need to be dramatic. It needs to be real. Commit to making that choice every day for the next 2 weeks. Not because 2 weeks will transform you, but because 2 weeks of consistent evidence that you do what you said you would do begins to change the story you tell yourself about what kind of person you are. And the story you tell yourself about who you are determines, more than almost anything else, what you are capable of becoming. The 40% rule redefines your limit. The third lesson, and the one that should permanently alter how you interpret the feeling of wanting to stop, is that the sensation of reaching your limit is almost never an accurate signal. Goggins' 40% rule is not a precise scientific measurement. It is a psychological orientation, a way of approaching discomfort that treats the first wave of wanting to stop not as a conclusion, but as a beginning. When your mind tells you that you have given everything you have, the honest question to ask is whether you have actually tested that claim or simply accepted it. Most of the time, the claim is accepted without testing. The practical application requires deliberate, controlled, regular exposure to voluntary discomfort, the kind that is challenging but not injurious. A workout extended past the point where you wanted to stop. A difficult conversation pursued rather than postponed. A creative project continued past the moment when the initial enthusiasm faded. The purpose is not to suffer for its own sake. The purpose is to repeatedly gather personal evidence that the first feeling of wanting to stop is not the true signal. Over time, that evidence accumulates into a different relationship with difficulty, one where the discomfort is recognized as the marker of the threshold, not the ceiling. Callous. Your mind, like you callous your body. The fourth lesson Goggins teaches is that mental toughness is not a personality trait you either have or do not have. It is a physical adaptation, developed through the same mechanism that produces calluses on your hands. Friction over time, applied consistently and deliberately, produces hardening. The person who avoids discomfort keeps a soft mind that breaks the first time real adversity arrives. The person who seeks out manageable difficulty regularly, expanding the boundary incrementally over time, builds a mind that adversity can bruise but cannot break. The architecture of mental toughness is not mysterious. It is just unglamorous. The practical application is to build what Goggins calls a hard schedule, one that contains at least one genuinely uncomfortable element every single day without exception. Not dramatic suffering, sustainable discomfort, a cold shower, an early morning, a physical challenge you know will be unpleasant, a creative or professional task you have been avoiding. The specific activity matters far less than the consistency. What the mind learns from daily encounters with voluntary discomfort is not that hard things are enjoyable. It learns that hard things are survivable. And survivable, practiced enough, eventually becomes normal. Failure contains the instructions for what comes next. The fifth and final lesson this book leaves embedded in every chapter is the one that separates the people who grow from the people who merely endure, and it is the practice of treating failure as operational data rather than emotional verdict. Most people experience failure as a statement about who they are. Goggins experiences it as a statement about what to adjust. The distinction sounds subtle until you observe the behavioral difference it produces. The person who treats failure as identity backs away from risk to protect themselves from more evidence against themselves. The person who treats it as data moves toward the next attempt with more information than they had before. The practical application is to institute your own version of the after-action review for any significant setback you experience in the next 30 days. When something does not go the way you intended, resist the instinct to either rationalize it away or beat yourself up for it. Instead, ask 3 specific questions. What exactly happened? What was my specific contribution to that outcome? And what one behavioral adjustment would change the result next time? Write the answers. Keep the record. Over time, this practice converts your failures from a collection of painful memories into a strategic archive of your most valuable lessons. The Vault Closing Can't Hurt Me is not ultimately a book about David Goggins. It is a book about you, about the version of you that has been waiting, perhaps for years, behind the comfortable story you have been telling yourself about your limits, your past, and what you are capable of. Goggins does not offer sympathy for that story. He offers something more valuable, the unambiguous proof, delivered through a life that defies every reasonable expectation, that the story is negotiable, that the limits you believe in most firmly are precisely the ones most worth questioning. Here is the one action you can take within the next 7 days. Choose one thing you have been avoiding because it is uncomfortable, difficult, or likely to expose a gap between where you are and where you want to be. Something specific, something real. Do it this week without waiting for motivation to arrive first, because motivation follows action. It does not precede it. Do the uncomfortable thing first. Let the feeling of having done it become the first note in your cookie jar. That single choice, made this week, is not a small thing. It is the beginning of a different kind of evidence about who you are. If this analysis reached something real in you, take a moment right now to like this video, subscribe to the Book Vault, and leave a comment telling us the single insight from Goggins' story that hit hardest for you personally. This community is not built for passive observers. It is built for the people who want to be genuinely, uncomfortably, productively challenged by the ideas they encounter. Every analysis released here is designed with that person in mind, because that person is the only one who will actually do something with what they learn. The Book Vault is where that kind of person comes to sharpen their edge. We will see you in the next one.